Hello and welcome to Sky News Climate Cast. I'm Samantha Washington. On this week's podcast, I'll be speaking to Professor Sir Partha Dasgupta from the University of Cambridge about the economics of biodiversity and why we don't value public goods like the oceans, the rainforests, as we should do, because if we did then value them, then we could be incentivized to protect them. And he tells me that really we're at a stage ahead of COP26 where what we really need is collective action, like we saw after World War II, something like a Marshall Plan for the environment.
COP15 and COP26, to the best of my knowledge, are not discussing the possibility of creating a new international institution. We don't have the imagination at the moment to do that.
And later, our climate reporter, Victoria Seabrook, will be joining us for a roundup of all of the latest climate news. But first, this week, our climate change correspondent Hannah Thomas-Peter and her team travelled to the African country of Gabon for a very special report.
We're in Gabon on the west coast of Central Africa at the invitation of its government. They are flying us deep into the jungle. The aim, to help us understand more about one of the most forested nations on the planet. We're in a section of rainforest just outside Libreville, the capital of Gabon, and it is full of the most extraordinary trees. The only way to get around efficiently in Gabon, once you leave the capital, Libreville, which is on the coast and has a couple of main roads, is to get on a helicopter. And so we did that. We went on a Gabonese military helicopter. We flew in a convoy of 3 from Libreville into the centre of the country to a place called Lope National Park. From above the canopy, you get a real sense of the sheer scale of this forest, stretching for hundreds of miles in every direction. It was the best way to do it. When you fly above the canopy, you just see how densely packed it is. Lots of people described it to us as a huge broccoli, which we thought was a strange description. But when you get up there, that is exactly what it looks like. It's quite extraordinary to see. It's the kind of tree that makes this forest such an important ecosystem because it stores carbon underground and it also sucks a huge amount of carbon out of the air. So this rainforest covers almost 90% of Gabon. It makes it one of the most forested countries on the planet, and in turn that makes up part of the Great Congo Basin rainforest, which is one of the most important ecosystems on the planet, and it's known as the lungs of Africa. Gabon has been able to afford to leave this jungle alone because it's an oil-rich nation. But prices are plummeting, production dwindling, and so that's about to change. The Environment Minister Lee White, who is British-born, but the Environment Minister in Gabon, said that, in essence, over the next 20 years, about 60% of Gabon's economy is going to disappear because of dwindling oil revenues. That is a big problem for a nation whose population is really young. More than half of Gabon's population is under 20, and all of those people need jobs. They're not going to find those jobs in the fossil fuel economy. There is a very, very small kind of agriculture industry because it's expensive and difficult to clear the rainforest. And the conditions aren't always conducive to growing crops that sell well in markets domestically and internationally. The other issue is tourism hasn't got off the ground yet at all in Gabon because it's hard to move around, it's difficult to get to, and it hasn't got there in terms of the tourism industry, not in the way it wants to, although efforts are being made.
We have to replace those revenues with something else.
That something else is the forest. Gabon wants the international community to pay it for careful conservation or risk deforestation for logging and agriculture.
I think it would be very difficult to maintain forests long term without a real partnership between developed and developing countries, and without a business model, an economic model that makes rainforests valuable for the people that live in them.
So the answer lies in the forest, according to the Gabonese government, and it is asking to be paid not to chop it down. And there's a kind of implicit threat behind what it's saying to the international community ahead of COP26, which is the UN Climate Summit being held in Glasgow later this year, which is, we're doing our best to conserve this absolutely vital natural resource for the planet, but it needs to become an economic resource for us. The easy option is to chop it down, which is what every other developing nation in the tropics has done. We don't want to take the easy option, we want to conserve it, but you have to make that commercially viable for us, or the inevitable will happen. At the moment, there's a system called RED, which is an acronym describing the system that allows payments to countries for reducing their deforestation. And Gabon's really annoyed about this payment system because it says that it incentivizes people to stop bad behavior. So you get a lot of money if you're the Brazilian government for reducing deforestation. And Gabon's argument is we can't reduce something we've never done. So we don't get access to this payment system that's been set up by the international community. And anyway, they want to do something which is a bit more commercial, which is essentially create forest bonds, that the forest and all of the carbon sequestration that it does is the underlying asset for a set of new financial tools that has intrinsic value and has value on the international market. Now, that is a really novel idea. The idea isn't as far-fetched as you might think. Norway, for example, has already given over $100 million to Gabon for its forest services. So there's been some proof that it's commercially viable, but Gabon needs it to be on a much larger scale, and it needs governments and commercial entities to kind of buy into this idea, and that needs to happen quickly. The Environment Minister thinks they've got about 10 years to make the forest economy work as a new revenue stream to replace the oil revenue stream. Gabon is one of the few countries on Earth that absorbs more carbon than it emits. It's why this whole region is crucial to the battle against climate change, and why what happens here will matter far beyond national borders. This is the strength of Gabon's negotiating position at the COP26 UN Climate Summit later this year. Tongi Gahuma Bakali is the man making the argument for a new carbon market that rewards conservation. It's an amazing country because there's flora and fauna there that you don't get anywhere else in the world, but the particularly exciting element, for me anyway, was the biodiversity of the big animals, so elephants and chimps and monkeys and buffalo.
Firstly, we are looking for a forest elephant. Here we have two species of elephants. We have a savanna and the forest elephant.
We were closely shepherded as well by some really interesting people called rangers, or in that country they're called eco guards, and they work in the national forests and the national park system, and they know a huge amount about local wildlife, trees, plants and wildlife in particular. And they took us out on safari a couple of times, and they are eagle-eyed. I mean, we couldn't see anything in this densely packed rainforest, kind of dotted with savanna. But they would grind to a halt, and we'd all nearly fall out of the safari truck and point at some completely indistinguishable kind of dot on the horizon. And over there would be a forest elephant or a chimp, and it was magical. Degrading the forest would put one of the most biodiverse regions on the planet at risk. In Lope National Park, we see just some of the wildlife that lives here. A family of chimps crossing the savannah, and later, forest elephants. More than 50,000 of them live in Gabon. Forest elephants in particular are fascinating because 60% of the world's population live in the Gabonese rainforest. And they're interesting animals because they require being left entirely alone to thrive. And that's what Gabon has done to its rainforest. And so this very happy population of forest elephants exists in this pristine, primal rainforest. We were warned a little bit about how difficult it was to find them because they're quite shy. They're also quite irritable. They're skittish because they're forest animals, and so they're kind of hardwired to be cautious because you can kind of come upon threats without being able to see them very clearly in a dark, densely packed rainforest. But that threat is also enhanced by the fact that these elephants love to eat rotting mangoes, which, when they ferment, makes them drunk and a little bit argumentative and fighty. And they also eat a particular kind of bush that drugs them. So when you come across a forest elephant, you don't know whether it's going to be stoned or drunk or frightened, and you have to be really quite careful. So the eco guards were at pains to tell us to stay well away, but just to observe and enjoy the magic, and we definitely got an opportunity to do that. Gabon is at a crossroads, trying to make an environmental asset profitable without destroying it. A model for the future, but only if the rest of the world agrees. Hannah Thomas-Peter, Sky News in Gabon.
Welcome back to ClimateCast. In 2019, the UK Treasury commissioned Professor Sir Partha Dasgupta to look into the economics of biodiversity. The resulting report is expected to form part of the UK government's 25-year climate plan. The Dasgupta review describes nature as our most precious asset and must be at the heart of economics, claiming that humanity has collectively mismanaged its global portfolio. Well, Professor Dasgupta says his overarching aim is the reconstruction of economics to include nature as an ingredient, and saying that humanity would need 1.6 Earths to maintain our current way of life. So good morning, Professor Dasgupta. It's a great pleasure to speak to you on ClimateCast for Sky News. I wanted to start by asking you have described nature as a blind spot in economics. What do you mean by that?
Well, it's largely that nature doesn't appear in any of the models that economists use for charting future economic trajectories. We build our models on the basis of produced capital and human capital, but natural capital, Mother Nature, which is providing us all the services, doesn't appear.
If we think broadly about economics as the study of resources, supply and demand, I think we can say safely, can't we, that the demand for the resources outstrips the supply?
That's exactly right. I would rather use the expression demand for nature's goods and services rather than resources, because many of the services are intangible. They're not visible. They're not audible. So they go missing. But when you use the term resources, I think one's mind goes to oil and natural gas, water, and so forth. But it's the intangible ones which are really key, because the reason we are overdoing it, we're overshooting, is that these services go unaccounted for in our transactions. It is perhaps unfortunate, given the advances we have made as civilizations, that our emotions were etched in Paleolithic times, and we are small group animals. So while we do take collective action in the neighborhood, small-scale actions, which are extremely important for local populations. But I think when you extend it, we run into problems. But the fact is that we have gone so smart. Scientific advances, technological advances have outstripped our innate capacity to cooperate, i.e. take collective action. And that's one of the implications of that is the crisis that we now face with biodiversity loss, climate change, and more generally, the degradation of the biosphere.
Can I ask you about a problem that we've been looking at here on the Climate Show at Sky News? And we've sent a reporter to Gabon, where their revenues from oil are drying up. So they're going to have to start a program of deforestation because, of course, there's demand for the timber and they're very rich in timber there. How do you tell a developing nation that they can't exploit their natural resources when richer countries have been doing it and enjoying the economic growth that they get from it for decades?
So you're absolutely right. The question, the way you posed the question, tells us what the answer is. You can't. What you should do is to pay them to protect it, protect the rainforest, because the rainforests are a global public good. They benefit us all. We may not imagine that to be the case, but they do.
But who should pay for it, do you think, Professor Dasgupta?
Oh, the global community. And that is the point I was trying to get to in suggesting that we need an institutional arrangement, global institutional arrangement for managing the global commons on the one hand, which, like the oceans and the atmosphere as a sink for pollution, which are open access. And then also the global public goods like the tropical rainforests, which are not open access because they belong to national, they're confined to national jurisdiction. So we need to pay the nations to protect them because we are benefiting. And so we ought to pay, that's like as payment for ecosystem services. And I was suggesting that we could raise the revenue. When I say we, I mean the international institution that I'm imagining, from charges on the use of the global commons, like the oceans, the traffic that's born there. So we are not really looking at a huge amount to be generated through taxes. It's simply payments for services which are currently going free, and we are damaging ourselves.
So if we could correct that institutional failure, as you describe it, and put a price on things that currently don't have a price attached to them, and you could do it tomorrow, what would be your top priorities?
What you've hit upon are precisely, I think, the top priorities. And that is to say, we really need to manage the global public goods. Okay. One reason we need to think about them particularly now is that they're not being thought about at all. COP15 and COP26, to the best of my knowledge, are not discussing the possibility of creating a new international institution or international organization, say like the World Bank or the IMF, which were created at the end of the Second World War to supply global public goods. We don't have the imagination at the moment to do that. And I should really want to emphasize that your example from Gabon is a very good one, because it is not an accident that the richest biodiverse regions are in the tropics. And also, it's not an accident that those are the countries which are also amongst the poorest. So things in principle go together here. You won't be subsidizing rich countries to protect the rainforest. You're subsidizing poor countries. So if you have some eye towards international development, aid and so forth, well, it's staring at you in the face. Yeah. This won't be aid. This won't be aid. It's really paying for services that they're actually conferring the rest of humanity. So you're getting, bang for your buck, as it were.
Yeah, it sounds so simple, doesn't it, when you put it like that? So just leave us with some hope then, to the extent that we can fix these problems. Are we doing it?
Well, it depends on which problems you have in mind. I think the citizens of the world, those countries where, like ours, where we are privileged to be able to say what we think urgently, we ought to act more in concert and put pressure on our governments to take nature seriously. And then there's plenty of material. After all, the governments are full of very bright people working for them. They're supposed to come up with concrete solutions for the overall ideas that now are common currency, like the ones you're raising here and the ones I write about. So it's not as though we're coming in from the cold. We understand quite a lot. And there are plenty of experts out there, ecologists, earth scientists, and we ought to employ them, ask for their advice. Together we can move pretty fast. I mean, we're pretty smart people. It's just that we can't seem to cooperate well enough.
Well, our climate reporter, Victoria Seabrook, has been monitoring all of the climate-related stories all week. And you're kicking us off with one about fast fashion, Victoria.
Yes, there's been quite a lot, actually. Primark this week promised that it was going to make all of its clothing from either recycled or more sustainably sourced material by 2030. It's also said that it's going to halve its emissions and pursue a living wage for workers. This announcement, it has been welcomed by environmentalists, but there has been some scepticism, particularly over this term more sustainable, that it allows a bit of room for manoeuvre. It's a bit vague. It's also been described as long on ambition and short on detail, and that's because consumers are really starting to want more when they're buying. They want to know where things are coming from and more transparency. Primark has said that it won't be putting up prices because of this. It says that sustainable shopping shouldn't be the preserve of the wealthy and only those who can afford it. We also had an announcement this week from ASOS. They want to be net zero by 2030. So we can really see the fashion industry starting to respond to criticism from campaigners who have criticised it for a long time. After all, the industry is responsible for 10% of greenhouse gas emissions from human activity. And at the moment, only 12% of clothing is actually recycled.
And from fast fashion, we're going to move on, intriguingly, onto a story about cake.
Yes, so we now know that the word cake has been mentioned on TV 10 times more than climate change last year. And you won't be surprised to know this, Sam, I know you like dogs. The word dog has been mentioned 22 times more. Now, this is according to analysis of almost 400 hours of TV programmes, excluding news, from all the main broadcasters. And it's done by Albert, which is a BAFTA-backed sustainability initiative for the screen industry. And it says it believes that TV can shape culture and prepare us for the big challenges of our time and how to face them. And another thing it picked up on is that mentions of individual action, things like recycling and veganism, were up, but mentions of the big sort of systemic change that we really need to reach net zero, things like renewables, were down.
Interesting. Never mind the carbon footprint of watching 400,000 hours of television output.
Well, exactly. Of course, TV does have a big carbon footprint itself.
And this week on Climate Cast, we've been looking all over the world, haven't we? We've been looking at Gabon, and you've also been looking into what's been going on in Indonesia.
Yes, this is a landmark ruling. The president of Indonesia, Joko Widodo, and top officials have been found guilty for failing to tackle chronic air pollution in Jakarta. That's the enormous and very heavily polluted and quite densely populated capital. This is a civil lawsuit filed 2 years ago against the president, as well as top ministers, including health and environment ministers and local officials. The citizens who brought the case, they said it was a last-ditch attempt to force them to take action, and it looks like they've been successful. The court found them negligent and has ordered them to clean up the dirty air, although we don't know yet if any of them plan to appeal.
Interesting. So we certainly need to keep an eye on that one, don't we?
Yes, indeed.
All right. Great having you on.
Thanks for having me.
Bye. Well, that's all for Climate Cast this week. Thank you for listening. The episode was presented by me, Samantha Washington, and produced by Chris Scott.